This is David Jebb again with the Paraglider Show, and we've got an interesting hour. The first hour, we're going to talk a little bit about the rush to fly, the team flying concept. We're going to talk a little bit about big ears, and finally conclude the first hour with a discussion on stalls. The second hour will be a pre-recorded taped interview with Uwe, from the head designer from the Paratech Paragliding Company out of Switzerland. So we will be playing a pre-recorded tape on the second hour, so you probably won't need to call in on the second hour. Okay, and Mike, it looks like, are we going to go, or is this going to be just a blip? Okay, so we're heading off, and we're running. So, hey, we had a great weekend this week, paragliding in Southern California. We took out about 13 folks down to a ridge down in Baja, California called San Antonio del Mar. And this is a great ridge. It's about an 8 or 10 mile ridge soaring site. Had great flying, great weekend of fun, relaxations, sitting on the coastal bluffs down in Baja in a very remote area. Spent the entire Easter weekend there having fun and flying. And the flying usually continued until sunset, and then after sunset, the big fire, campfire with the paraglider pilots just sitting around talking about the day's events, cooking dinner over the fire. I had a great time. So it's something we do every spring, is head down there for about 3 days, and it was just great. A couple things I wanted to talk about. The visit down there and the flying down there prompted a couple ideas to talk about this morning, and one of the ideas that I wanted to discuss was the rush to fly. And what I mean by that, we oftentimes come up to a launch site, we drive up to the launch site, and we get out of the car, the van, whatever, and the conditions look hot. I mean, they really look good. Everybody gets really excited, and all of a sudden there's a mad exodus to get the gear out of the vehicle and on your back and on the ground and ready to get out there and fly. And this typical rush that you see oftentimes can have some downsides, and I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about that, because the rush to get in the air, oftentimes in our haste, we find that, and we see this happening frequently, where the pilots are so hasty that they lay out their glider and they don't do a good pre-flight inspection of their equipment before taking off. And this oftentimes, you got people standing up there, everybody's racing to get up into the sky. You'll see people oftentimes launching with their helmet straps not securely fastened. You'll see people with 1 or 2 leg harnesses not strapped as they're pulling the glider up. You'll see people that haven't checked their pins and their reserve handles, and we've seen people take off with their parachutes falling out. This type of thing, and this is really not the ideal situation to get into the rush to fly. One of the things that I suggest that people do when they get out and the conditions are looking really hot is just to remember that the conditions aren't going to disappear overnight or in a matter of minutes. Conditions are probably going to stay good for some time. And if you take that approach, you can start as you get out, and even before arriving to launch, start to really look at the weather conditions and study the approaching conditions, especially out on the horizon. And when you get to launch, you really need to be cognizant of your surrounding environment and look at the changing conditions. For instance, oftentimes in the late afternoon, you leave the LZ headed for launch, and by the time you get up to launch, the conditions turned into dead air or a catabatic air. We oftentimes, for instance, this weekend, standing at the launch for San Antonio, we had another element that isn't nearly as common, but that's high tide. And so when the high tides come up, you have water against the cliff. Therefore, your landing zone is very, very treacherous, because you have to land either in water or very near to the water, lodged between a cliff and an ocean. And that can make for some pretty tricky handling of the glider, obviously, when you're deflating it or trying to bring it down and you got waves splashing up around your ankles. So the other thing that I oftentimes see is in the rush to fly or the rush to launch is the not surveying the LZ, not studying approaches for landing, and for studying alternative approaches in case the primary approach isn't going to work for you. These are really, really important issues. We have a couple landing areas in which you cannot see the landing zone from launch, and unless you're familiar with the site and unless you've got a clear mental picture of the landing area and the many approaches and alternative approaches, it's not a good idea to take off and fly until you have that part of the total flight process firmly in grasp and in hand. So again, we find that when people are rushing to get into the air, they fundamentally forget all of this basic pre-flight stuff. And the other thing that I've noticed, and this is particularly true, we saw this weekend, people show up at launch and oftentimes don't talk to the locals or the people standing on the ground. Talking to the pilots, or for instance, talking to the pilots that may be in the air, this is really amazing, because we oftentimes see locals standing on the ground and pilots just hanging around launch. Somebody drives up and frantically starts laying out their gear, hooking in, and of course the locals think, well, this person must really know what he's doing or must really be a hotshot pilot. Won't say anything, and the person takes off, and 5 seconds into that flight they realize, man, this guy doesn't have a clue of what is going on. So again, this rush to flight is going to get a lot of pilots in trouble until they stop and they realize that, look, I've got to develop a routine and stick with it in my flying career, and that routine should involve, a careful inspection of all your gear, a careful pre-flight inspection, a careful analysis of weather, a careful analysis of landing area, takeoff area. All these things should really, really be looked at and studied. And it doesn't matter if, in fact, you're familiar with the site. If you just come up, jump out of your car, throw your gear on the ground, start hooking up and running out, again, you could be making a mistake. So let's in our flying, in our routine, let's develop a routine where we do all of these safety things, and we talk to people, and we inspect our equipment, and we form a firm, safe flight plan, and then stick with it. And I think if we do that, we're going to find we have a lot fewer problems in the sport of paragliding. So again, I'd like to encourage you to give us a call at World Talk Radio. The Paraglider Show is on every Tuesday from 9 to 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And of course, after the show, the program is put into the World Talk Radio archives, so you can listen to this program repeatedly through the archives and for some time to come. Now, if you'd like to give us a toll-free call in North America, that number is 1-888-514-2100. That's 888-514-2100. Our international toll line, if you'd like to give us a call from overseas, you may. That number is 001-858-268-3068. And love to hear from our guest, our overseas guests. We've got this program set up on Tuesday morning in Southern California time so that our overseas listeners can call us at a halfway decent hour. And that's probably, this time of the year, means that many people will still be out flying. They still may not be able to get to the phone. So, again, the greatest thing about the show is the fact that it's archived, and you can listen to the show well after the flying is over. Now, a couple notes. Gabriel's not in today, and he's actually out in Southeast Asia, and I believe he's right now in Indonesia, and he's doing some networking and some instructing with pilots in that area of the world. It's a great flying area, semi-tropics, and tropical environment, actually, and a lot of ocean, a lot of great QMEs and thermal flying out in that part of the world. So he's probably having a real good time. I don't expect him to call in because he's usually out in the parts of the flying terrain where there's not too many phones, and I'm not sure that his phone will get through. But he's out there right now and probably having a good time. So wish him the very best of luck and look forward to him getting back next week to join us on the air. Okay. Now, another concept, let me give you an example. We're talking a little bit about Rush the Fly, and the classic example that I saw this weekend was we get there on Friday afternoon, and the air is just coming in straight in. It's blowing about 15, 18 out of the west, and everybody is just, absolutely elated. And a few of the senior pilots lay out, grab their gear, lay out, and throw everything up, and next thing you know, quite a few guys are racing to get into the air. Well, some of the newer pilots had to kind of stand on the ground and wait until the conditions got a little bit lighter, and that happened just about 10 minutes before sunset. And finally, when one of the newer pilots did take off, the air was just dying as the last pilot in the sky was landing when this guy took off, and it had turned slightly north. And he made this newer pilot made his first turn to the south going downwind. And as he launched, I noted that the tide was slapping up against the rocks in the cliff down below. And he flew about 100 yards and landed downwind in a pile of rocks and fell. And when he fell, his glider dropped completely into the surf, and consequently he had a mess on his hands, and he was lucky that he wasn't seriously hurt. But he came back in the dark with a totally sand and salt water in his glider, tied up in numerous knots and line-overs, and that kind of ruined his whole Friday evening and Saturday daytime because he didn't do any flying. He kind of hurt his ankle and sprained his wrist, and his glider was too wet to fly. So that 10-second of flying cost him the whole weekend of actually having a good time with everybody else. So again, this rush to fly sometimes can get us in real deep trouble. Looks like we have a caller online, and this guy is somebody that's very familiar to the show. It's Murray. And Murray, are you there with us?
I am indeed, yes.
How nice of you to call, man. How are things going in your area of the world?
Well, we've been having a really interesting few days. Made the headlines on a couple of the papers.
Well, tell us about this. It sounds exciting. What's going on?
Well, fortunately not exciting. It was very calm, very relaxed and all the rest of it. The club barbecue for the General Aviation Flying Club was held on Saturday. And quite often at the weekends, particularly when it's a public holiday here, air traffic control is actually closed if there's no commercial flights in.
Right.
So I was up at a site about 10 miles northwest of Dundee, Little Barlow, and even though air traffic control was closed, I had my radio on the local frequency as normal. And we had one of our part-time instructors who is shortly to leave the Royal Air Force and become a full-time instructor, was flying an aerobatic club aircraft. It's not a commercial one, it's not like a Cessna. This is a Tipsy Nipper, which most people will never have heard of.
Right.
But your hands start the prop, but it's fully aerobatic. So he was about 3,000 feet above the hill and just headed a wee bit off, and then suddenly radio call. So I kept quiet for about 20 seconds in case there was a more, shall we say, professional general aviation pilot online. There was no one else online. Engine failure. So the long and the short of it was immediate landing on the Paraglider, radio on one side, passing on the MayDay, mobile phone on the other side, speaking to the flying club, and the chap, by the time we got down to where he was and the rescue services arrived, he'd sort of dug his way out of the aircraft, which was upside down in the field and almost undamaged. He did an absolute classic.